Today we're diving into something really powerful. It's a complex and honestly, sometimes incredibly dark reality that your standard high school history textbooks almost always skip right over. For generations, millions of us were taught this super simplified version of Native American history. But the real story? It's so much bigger and more fascinating than what we learned. We're going to look at the rise of massive Native confederacies, continental wars, broken treaties, and the incredible cultures that survived against literally all odds.
So, I want you to ask yourself, what if the story of America actually began way before Columbus ever set sail? We kind of need to completely rewire our baseline education here, because before European settlers ever set foot on this continent, North America was far from some empty, untouched wilderness. No way. It was a continent completely filled with thriving civilizations. We are talking about massive nations with advanced political systems, sprawling trade networks, complex diplomacy, and frankly, brilliant engineering. Okay, let's dive right into this. We were all handed this textbook myth, right? Small tribes, teepees, following the buffalo, and then just inevitably fading away into history. But the historical reality was vastly different. These were advanced, complex nations. Native Americans were shrewd diplomats, fierce warriors, global traders, architects, and really savvy political strategists. They absolutely weren't just frozen in time waiting for history to happen to them. They were the ones actively shaping it.
Which brings us to our first major era, nations before the nation, a continent of civilizations.
Think about this. Long before the United States Constitution was even a spark of an idea, millions of indigenous people were living across North America in these incredibly organized, deeply stable governments. The sheer scale of what they built is just awe-inspiring. I mean, centuries before the U.S. was founded, the Haudenosaunee united multiple nations under a representative system. And get this, some researchers believe it actually influenced our early American thinkers. Meanwhile, the Cherokee developed a completely unique written language from scratch. Out west, the Pueblo engineered these massive multi-story adobe cities. And the Mississippian cultures, they built giant earthwork cities, like Cahokia. To put that into perspective, Cahokia was actually larger than London at the time, and it sat right at the beating heart of continental trade networks.
But as the landscape changed, so did the story. That takes us to part 2, the Trail of Tears, Treaties and Betrayal. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing exactly how the Cherokee Nation adapted to try and survive in a rapidly changing America. By the early 1800s, they had actually created their own newspapers, they established formal schools, they even drafted a written constitution and built a complete legal system modeled partly after the United States. They did literally everything right to integrate. They proved without a doubt that peaceful coexistence was absolutely possible. But, as you'll see, watch how quickly that all unraveled. It started with peaceful adaptation, but then hit this massive, catastrophic turning point. Gold was discovered in Georgia. Suddenly, the land the Cherokee were living on became way more valuable than the legal treaties actually protecting it. And here's the wild part. The United States Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee. They recognized their sovereignty. But President Andrew Jackson? He just completely ignored the highest court in the land. He broke the treaties and forcefully pushed through removal policies. And the main driver for all of this? Just so plantation agriculture and cotton production could wildly expand across the American South. The result of that decision was a catastrophic human toll. Families were literally rounded up at gunpoint, and entire communities were forced to march westward in what we now know as the Trail of Tears. Thousands upon thousands died from disease, starvation, and extreme exposure along the way. But, it is absolutely vital to remember, and textbooks almost always skip this, the Cherokee were not alone in this nightmare. The Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole nations were also brutally and forcibly displaced. This wasn't just relocation. It was nothing short of cultural destruction. Let's shift our focus now to part 3, resistance on the plains. Defending the homeland. So we're moving westward now out to the Great Plains. Pop culture really loves to sell us this whole myth of the Wild West, right? A dusty landscape mostly full of cowboys and outlaws. But the actual reality is that the Great Plains were the stage for one of the fiercest homeland defense movements in all of American history. The Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, and other Plains nations fought incredibly hard to defend their ancestral homelands against expanding railroads, settlers, and the U.S. military. Now, initially, treaties did guarantee parts of the plains to these nations, But, surprise, surprise, history repeated itself. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and those treaties instantly became inconvenient obstacles. So legendary leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse emerged as these powerful symbols of resistance. And in 1876, they achieved one of the most shocking military victories against the U.S. ever, the Battle of Little Bighorn, where General Custer's forces were completely, utterly overwhelmed.
So the crucial point is what happened immediately after that. Realizing they just couldn't win a traditional military conflict against these brilliant tacticians, the U.S. government shifted to a strategy of total devastation. They intentionally went out and slaughtered the buffalo populations by the millions. Think about that. They deliberately caused the entire food system of the Plains nations to just completely collapse. They then aggressively expanded the reservation system. This loss wasn't just military. It was a deeply calculated economic, spiritual, and cultural destruction designed to make any continued resistance absolutely impossible.
Which brings us to perhaps the darkest chapter of this explainer, Part 4, Era of Cultural Erasure, the boarding schools.
After the outright wars ended, the strategy shifted yet again. The goal of the U.S. government was no longer just to defeat tribes on the battlefield or confine them to reservations. The new, incredibly chilling goal was the total erasure of indigenous identity itself. And this infamous phrase right here really summarizes the entire policy of the era. Kill the Indian, save the man. It is a devastating, heartbreaking approach that squarely targeted the absolute most vulnerable members of the tribes, the children.
The systematic process they used was just devastating. First, government agents would forcefully remove children from their loving families and communities. Next, they stripped them of their visual identity, cutting off their hair and confiscating all traditional clothing. Then came the strict bans on speaking any native languages, which were enforced with severe punishment and physical abuse. Tragically, many of these children never even returned home. Entire generations lost their deep cultural connections. And let me be clear, the profound trauma from these boarding schools still heavily affects Native families to this very day.
But we are not ending this explainer on a note of defeat. Part 5, Survival and Modern Resurgence.
Because the story of Native American tribes simply does not end in tragedy. We are pivoting now to the modern era, and it is the story of unbelievable resilience. Because despite the devastating diseases, the forced removals, the warfare, and a deliberate campaign of cultural erasure, Native history outright refused to be erased. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredible survival of Indigenous communities today. They're out there actively fighting for and winning their sovereignty and land rights. They are reviving beautiful traditions that were specifically targeted for destruction. Traditional languages are being taught in schools again. Ancient ceremonies are continuing. They didn't just survive the storm. They are actively enduring and rebuilding their cultural foundations stronger than ever.
So, as we step back and look at the full picture today, it forces a really uncomfortable but completely necessary question. What does progress actually mean? You know, the traditional national myth of inevitable westward expansion portrays this country as just destined to grow. But we really have to pause and reconsider that narrative when freedom and expansion for one group meant the systematic displacement and destruction of another. When treaties are repeatedly, blatantly broken in the name of growth, whose progress are we actually celebrating?
Perhaps the absolute biggest misconception high school history textbooks ever created was the idea that Native Americans belong only to the past. They do not. Indigenous people are an active, vibrant, and incredibly vital part of America's present. So I'll leave you with this. If Native history isn't just some closed chapter gathering dust, but the very foundation of our present day, how will it shape our future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.